My name is Miles Carter, and for as long as I can remember, I believed that love was supposed to feel like coming home, warm, safe, familiar. When I married Delilah 3 years ago, I pictured our life together as an unbroken current, carrying us forward into laughter and shared dreams. She was everything I thought I wanted, confident enough to light up any room, charming enough to make strangers feel like old friends, driven enough to inspire me to keep up. But lately, I began to feel like a background character in my own life, a supporting actor in a story I once wrote the lines for. When she asked me to join her for dinner with her inner circle, Sloane, Maribel, and Ivy, I thought I saw a lifeline. Maybe this was the moment when we'd bring me back into the narrative. I didn't realize I was walking into a trap disguised as an elegant evening. I arrived at the restaurant 5 minutes early, heart fluttering with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The city skyline stretched in the twilight behind me as I pushed through the ornate brass door and stepped into the hushed glow of candlelight. The host showed me to a table in the corner, and I spotted Delilah already seated, in a sleek black dress that caught the light with every turn of her head. She looked radiant, warm smile, eyes glinting, until she saw me. Then her smile flickered, just for a second, like a candle's flame caught in a breeze. She rose, gave me a quick kiss on the cheek that felt perfunctory, and sat back down, never breaking eye contact with Sloane. Sloane, the ringleader, if her poised shoulders and arched eyebrow were any indication, gave me a slow, measured nod as I slid into the seat across from Delilah. She held her wine glass like a chalice, red liquid swirling in the dim light. Maribel sat next to her, gaze flicking between me and the menu, her lips pressed together as if she were keeping some private joke to herself. Ivy. Quiet Ivy, whose laughter always sounded genuine, who watched the world like an outsider peeking through a window, leaned back in her chair, arms folded, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Delilah's chestnut hair brushed my shoulder as she leaned toward Ivy, whispering something that made both of them laugh softly, eyes glancing in my direction. I felt the laughter as a breeze whispering through my spine, leaving me cold. When drinks arrived, cocktails and glittering glasses, I ordered a beer, hoping for something grounded, simple. But even my choice became a weapon. Sloane's head snapped toward me, and she leaned in so that her perfume drifted across the table, jasmine and smoke. "Just a beer?" she asked, voice smooth as satin and twice as cutting. "Come on, Miles, loosen up." The way she emphasized my name made it sound like a taunt rather than an introduction. I offered a tight smile and took a sip, hoping the taste of the lager would anchor me. Instead, I felt adrift. Delilah slid a cocktail straw aside and watched me with those familiar green eyes that once held me close in the chaotic swirl of New Year's Eve parties and late-night study sessions. Now they seemed distant. "I thought you'd like the place," she said quietly, though her tone held none of the warmth I remembered. "I used to come here with them all the time." Her hands rested on the table, palms down, as if trying to claim the wood grain as her own. The table felt too small for the four of them to judge me from their various corners. From that moment, the conversation became an ambush. Sloane took it upon herself to narrate Delilah's romantic history as though I were reading the footnotes in a biography. She described Ryan from Barcelona, so worldly, so passionate, she said, her fingertips brushing the rim of her glass in emphasis. Then Troy the sculptor, tall, quiet, mysterious. Maribel chimed in before I could stop her. Ivy just sat back, lips curved in a subtle smirk, observing me as if I were an experimental subject in an anthropological study. Delilah laughed along, leaning toward Sloane, nodding as though she'd invited me to see how well the old stories held up next to the new chapter one represented. I tried to inject something of my own, an anecdote from our trip to Denver, a memory of hiking through aspen groves, but my words stalled before they reached the table. The air felt thick, charged with unspoken judgments that pressed against my ribs. I forced another smile, lifted my beer, and cleared my throat. "Remember when I began," but Sloane cut in. "You're different from her usual type, Miles," she said, and her voice dropped an octave as though revealing a secret she knew I wasn't privy to. Delilah used to love adventure. Her gaze slid over me, lingering on my cufflinks and the tailored fit of my jacket. "You're domesticated." The word landed between us like a brick. Delilah's laugh rang out, bright and a little brittle. "Miles is perfect for me," she said, flicking her hair over her shoulder. "But sometimes you need someone to push you out of your shell." She raised her glass in Sloane's direction, as if toasting a shared joke. I felt my face grow warm and my heart sink in equal measure. The notion wasn't new. I'd sensed the shift coming for months, but hearing it pronounced aloud, watching her embrace it, felt like a betrayal so sudden it took my breath away. I kept my voice level as I replied, I love you, Delilah. I thought tonight was about us, about me meeting your friends, getting to know the people you care about. My words sounded smaller than I wanted them to be. Maribel shrugged and swirled the imported wine in her glass. We just want to understand what you see in him, she said sweetly. Ivy's smile flickered, and she glanced at Delilah, eyebrows raised. Dinner arrived in courses artfully plated, each dish a statement. I pushed food around my plate, tasting nothing, while Sloane regaled them with stories of how Delilah once danced until dawn on rooftops, how Troy built her a sculpture shaped like a phoenix. They described every detail as though painting her former lives onto canvases I'd never touched. Delilah sat there, radiating an odd kind of pride at every story, never once defending me or shutting down the narrative. Each laugh from the table felt like another brick in the wall that separated me from the woman I thought I knew. By the time dessert arrived, flambéed cherries dripping over vanilla bean soufflé, I felt hollowed out. The hushed restaurant lights no longer held any charm. They only spotlighted how small I felt. I pushed my chair back, paid the bill without argument, even when it came to nearly $500, and stood. Delilah looked up, wearing that practiced expression of remorse that arrived too late. Miles, wait, she began. But I shook my head. Enjoy the rest of your night, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. I left without turning back, stepping out into the cool night air that felt cleaner than anything inside that dining room. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it. I didn't need messages or calls. I needed quiet, and whatever came next, I'd face it on my own terms, not as a pawn in someone else's game. The moment I stepped into the restaurant, I could feel the temperature drop. Not the air conditioning, it was a sweltering July evening, and the glass doors had hardly swung shut before the gentle breeze of the sidewalk was replaced with the taut silence that hung over Delilah's friends like a storm cloud. I followed her through the vestibule, my heart drumming against my ribs, each beat a question. What have I walked into? She led me past the hostess stand and down a short corridor lit by low-hung lanterns, soft jazz spilling from a speaker hidden somewhere near the ceiling. From around the curve of a banquette, I saw them waiting, Sloane, Maribel, and Ivy, clustered together like conspirators, their bodies angled away from the rest of the dining room, as if they existed in a private orbit. Sloane rose first, all ice-blue eyes and alabaster skin, extending her hand with the precision of someone who had perfected the art of first impressions. I slipped my palm into hers and felt a whisper of expectation, like a wire stretched tight. Miles, she said, her voice measured, almost melodic. Welcome. There was an edge to the single syllable that made me swallow. Maribel stood next, brushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear. She was the kind of woman whose eyes cataloged details, my cufflinks, the cut of my jacket, the slight indentations in my shoes. She tilted her head, smiled, and said, Finally, Delilah's told us so much about you. The words were polite, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Instead, they glimmered with something unreadable. Appraisal? Skepticism? I couldn't tell. Last was Ivy, leaning casually against the banquette backrest as though she had no need for posture. She wore a relaxed grin, the kind that felt disarming because it seemed genuinely amused. Her laughter in chairs I'd seen her occupy before had always felt like an invitation. Tonight it was an enigma. She gave me a small nod and a soft, "Good to meet you, Miles." It felt like bait, and I bit down on the urge to ask, "Really? What are you testing me for?" Delilah came to rest beside me, her fingers brushing mine as she slid into the bench. She was radiant in confidence, but it wasn't the warmth of homecoming I'd expected. It was triumphant, as if she were leading me into a show she'd rehearsed without me. She placed a hand on my forearm. "They're so excited to finally get to know you," she said. I wanted to believe her, to set aside the flutter of nerves in my chest, but Sloane's smirk as she turned back to her companion spoke volumes. This was performance, not reunion. We ordered drinks, cocktails, and crystal glasses, each one more extravagant than the last. Sloane's concoction gave off wisps of smoke that curled around the stem. Maribel chose an imported burgundy that looked dark as spilled ink. Ivy's drink arrived in a tall flute, bubbles rising like effervescent whispers. When the waiter asked for my choice, I said, "Just a beer, please." The words fell flat, like a script misread. "Just a beer," Sloane repeated, her tone buttery sweet, as though she were praising a child's attempt at formal wear. "Come on, Miles, loosen up." She flashed a grin that felt razor-sharp beneath its sparkle. I offered a rueful smile. Thanks, but I think this will do. The beer arrived 10 seconds later. I clasped the glass, hoping the cold brass of it would steady me. Instead, it trembled in my hand. Delilah leaned in, looking up at Sloane with that practiced intimacy she shared with these women. He's really different, she said softly, as though revealing a secret well worth sharing. But in a good way. My throat constricted at the implied contrast. Different from who, exactly? Sloane's laugh tinkled like glass. Oh, absolutely, she said, tracing the rim of her glass with a manicured nail. Just not what I expected. The waiter arrived with an amuse-bouche, a quenelle of something smoky and exotic on an obsidian spoon. We each took one, but I tasted only air. The conversation swirled around me, a current pulling me away from the solid ground I needed. Sloane recounted with relish how Delilah had once taken a spontaneous flight to Barcelona to visit an ex-boyfriend, Ryan, apparently, and how she dressed in his expatriate art studio, surrounded by canvases that smelled like oil paint and regret. At first I grimaced, thinking Delilah would interject, but she simply sipped her cocktail and let the story unfurl. Maribel added details about Troy the sculptor, handsome and brooding, who once sculpted Delilah's profile in marble. Ivy chuckled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, and said, and don't forget Leo, the DJ she met in Ibiza. He spun vinyl until dawn just so she'd dance barefoot on the sand. They leaned into each other, as though each whispered memory reaffirmed their bond, a bond that, conspicuously, didn't include me. I tried to speak up, to draw their focus back to the present. We just got back from Denver, I began. Delilah and I hiked Red Rocks, and my words died somewhere between intent and breath. A beat passed. Then Sloane cut in. That sounds charming, Miles. But you're not exactly the adrenaline type, are you? Her smile was indulgent, as though she'd just patted a puppy on the head for trying to catch its tail. Delilah laughed, a bright sound that felt out of place next to the quiet whine in my chest. He's more of a comfort guy, she said. You know, stability. The words hung between us like a verdict. I swallowed hard. Stability isn't a bad thing, I said, firming my voice. I like knowing where I stand. Really? Maribel asked, arching a brow. That's so predictable. She clinked her wine glass against Delilah's cocktail. To predictability. I forced a sip of my beer, the foam prickling my lips. I prefer to call it reliable. Their laughter hopped across the table. Ivy's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, empathy flickering in her eyes before she masked it. Reliable, she echoed softly. Then she paused, leaning forward. You know, I actually respect that in some people. Her tone was sincere, but I could almost hear the unspoken caveat. In some people, not in Delilah. The meal progressed, appetizers arrived, then entrees, each dish more artful than the last. Fresh scallops nestled in pools of citrus foam. Tenderloin carved tableside, pink and glistening. I tasted nothing but discord. Every anecdote, every toast, every clink of glass felt designed to remind me of my misfit status. And Delilah never defended me. Instead, she leaned closer to Sloane, sharing inside jokes that dimmed the light around me. By the time dessert arrived, decadent slices of molten chocolate cake crowned with gold leaf, I felt small, irrelevant. The hush of the restaurant felt like a hush of judgment, the threadbare promise of connection severed long before I'd walked through those doors. I finished my beer and sat back, chest heaving with disappointment I couldn't articulate. Delilah reached across the table and placed a hand on mine. I looked up, searching for warmth in her eyes. But what I saw was a flicker of amusement, an acknowledgement that tonight had gone exactly as she'd planned. Thank you for coming, she said, voice low. No, I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. Thank you for the invitation. I stood, leaving a few bills on the table, untouched wine glasses, scattered crumbs of what might have been a pleasant evening. I didn't look back. I walked out into the humid night, the doors swinging shut behind me with a quiet finality. The soft strains of jazz lingered inside, but to me they were just the echo of a slow freeze. The moment I realized I was out of place in the life I'd thought was mine. I settled into the banquette opposite Sloane, Maribel, and Ivy as if I were still a player in this twisted game. But the moment the waiter cleared our appetites, the air shifted again, tense, expectant, and decidedly unwelcoming. Sloane swept her gaze across the table, glass poised at her lips, and began recounting tales of Delilah's past loves as though unveiling chapters of an epic novel. I remember Ryan in Barcelona, she said, voice lilting, how she'd wake before sunrise to wander the Gothic quarter, pausing beside ancient stones while he sketched her silhouette. The way he painted her life into his canvases, so romantic. At her words, Delilah closed her eyes briefly, the candlelight flickering across her eyelashes. I glanced at Delilah, hoping she'd meet my eye, drop a hint that we were partners now, not mere spectators of her history. But she only smiled, that quiet, indulgent curve of her lips, and turned back to Sloane as though the memory belonged to them both, not to any living present. Maribel chuckled, swirling her wine. And Troy the sculptor, oh, how he carved her name into marble. It took him weeks under the sun, chiseling every curve of her cheekbone. He loved her like a living statue. She reached across the table and lifted Delilah's hand for emphasis. Delilah let her fingers linger in Maribel's palm, like a secret passed among kindred spirits. I felt the words, living statue, as a taunt, a reminder that I would never match the grand gestures of these past romances. I tried to catch Delilah's gaze, but she studied her glass instead, the deep red liquid catching the candlelight. Then Ivy leaned forward, her eyes glinting with mischief. And Leo, the DJ in Ibiza, remember how they danced on the sand, beats throbbing under their feet? She'd laugh at the ridiculousness, barefoot and dizzy from wine and strobe lights. Ivy's laughter was soft, but there was something sharpened in her tone, as though each story were a blade aimed at my heart. I cleared my throat. It sounds incredible, I said, voice steadier than I felt. But we just got back from Denver. Delilah and I hiked Red Rocks. You should see the view at sunrise. We talked about everything, ourselves, our future. I paused, looking for a spark of acknowledgement, a lifeline. But the only response was strained silence. The candle between us sputtered, casting shadows that crawled across the table. Sloane tilted her head, smile never leaving her face, and said, "You're different from her usual type, Miles." She used to love adventure. The words hung there, as deliberate and cutting as shards of glass. Adventure. Not comfort. Not stability. Adventure, they implied, was a quality I could never claim. Delilah lifted her wine glass and sipped, her lips brushing the rim in a gesture so graceful it stopped my breath. She didn't look up. She waited, letting the words settle, allowing them to hang in the silence like accusations. When she finally spoke, it was still, almost rehearsed. We all have different strengths. No defense, no reassurance, just a placid acknowledgement that separated me from her usual type. My cheeks warmed, not with heat but with something sharper, the stinging realization that I had become an outsider in a circle I'd stepped into hoping to belong. I forced a laugh, hoping to break the tension, to remind them I was still present, still Miles. Well, I started, setting down my water glass so deliberately I almost heard it click on the wood. Sometimes a different kind of adventure is what you need, a quieter one, but just as meaningful. I thought of the look in Delilah's eyes when we'd stood at the rim of those red sandstone ridges, our breath mingling in the cold dawn air, of how she'd leaned against me when the sunrise turned the sky gold. But that image felt fragile now, like it belonged to another life. The group exchanged glances, Sloane's half-smile, Maribel's narrowed eyes, Ivy's polite nod, and then Sloane leaned back, swirling her drink. "Sure, if you say so." Her tone suggested she didn't believe me, that my assertion of a different adventure was laughable. The waiter brought our entrees, delicate fillets of sea bass for Sloane and Maribel, a wild mushroom risotto for Ivy, and for Delilah, a chef's specialty that arrived under a silver cloche. I ordered the steak, medium rare, as I liked it. But when it arrived, I sliced into it half-heartedly, chewing mechanically. The flavors blurred together. Every bite felt like a rehearsal for something I no longer knew the lines to. The group's chatter resumed, but it wasn't conversation, it was commentary, like a running broadcast dissecting my worth. I heard them mention how Delilah needed someone exciting, how laughter came when she danced, not when she sat still. Ivy's voice cut through, soft but firm, though. Sometimes, you need someone to keep you grounded. I turned to her, surprised. Was this empathy or another jab? And I wondered if she felt sorry for me, or if she was merely hedging her bets. Delilah caught Ivy's eye, and they exchanged a look that spoke volumes. An unspoken agreement passed like a torch. I cleared my throat again, trying one last time to stake my claim on this moment. "I love who she is when we're together," I said, my voice low. "And I think she's even more herself in quieter places than any grand adventure." My words felt vulnerable on my tongue, like I was exposing a secret wound. Delilah's brow furrowed, as though my admission surprised her. Sloane leaned forward, eyebrows lifted. "That's sweet, Miles." "Really," she said, her smile eerily serene. "But sweetness alone doesn't make fireworks." The metaphor stung. I imagined fireworks exploding behind my eyes, but no sparks flew. Instead, I felt the emptiness of a sky too vast to fill. I picked up my fork, stabbing at the tender meat, but soon put it down. I think I've had enough for tonight, I said softly, more to myself than to anyone at the table. I met Delilah's eyes at last, as that once promised partnership, now distant and cool. She raised her glass to me, the movement deliberate, and said, "To Miles, my different kind of adventure." The toast echoed around me, hollow and ironic. I smiled, stood, and slipped out of the booth before they could offer more of their hospitality or their judgment. Walking toward the exit, I felt their gazes trailing me, as if I were a petulant child sent away for misbehaving. Outside, the city's heat wrapped around me again, but it felt like relief. The night air tasted free, despite the ache in my chest. I hailed a cab in silence, the neon lights blurring through the window as the car pulled away. I thought of Denver's quiet mornings with Delilah, of genuine laughter shared over pancakes and coffee. I realized then that some chapters close so decisively you never see the end until you turn away. And that maybe the adventure I craved wasn't found in grand gestures or exotic locales, but in the simple constancy of someone who saw me, truly saw me, and chose me anyway. I stared at the menu for a moment before finally looking up at Sloane, who was already swirling the smoky concoction in her glass with slow, deliberate movements. Her eyes, those ice blue, calculating eyes, settled on me and, with a tilt of her head, silently demanded to know my order. Underneath her perfectly applied makeup, I detected a spark of curiosity, like she could hardly believe I was brave enough to come here as myself. I closed the menu, laid it flat on the table, and said, "I'll have a beer, please." The words felt heavier than I expected, as though I had declared some secret truth about my character. Maribel's lips curved into a gentle smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just a beer," she echoed, her tone criticizing rather than curious. "Nothing more festive?" She raised an eyebrow so high her expression became almost theatrical. "Festive." The word echoed in my mind while Delilah, seated next to her, reached to stroke my hand in a bid for normalcy. Her touch was warm, but the conviction behind it felt brittle. I offered her a small, reassuring smile and squeezed her fingers. "I'm all right," I said softly. "This is fine." Sloane leaned back, folding her arms as if she were settling in for a show. "Come on, Miles," she said, voice low enough that only I could hear. "It's not every night we get to celebrate together." The celebration in her eyes felt forced, like she was mocking me through Delilah. I cleared my throat. "Celebrate what?" I asked evenly, watching their faces with a gathering sense of unease. Delilah took that moment to lift her cocktail, her perfectly manicured nails gleaming in the soft light. "Us," she said, clinking her glass against Maribel's and Ivy's. The word felt hollow on her lips, as though she were half convinced herself that we still were in us. I raised my beer in a toast, uncertain if I was toasting to the brutal thing Delilah framed as us, or to my own attempt at holding my composure. "To us," I said, careful to keep my voice steady. The drink was cold and bitter when I took that first sip, a sharp reminder of my own reality. The waiter came back with 4 plates of amuse-bouche, tiny, exquisite morsels meant to whet our appetites, but the taste of smoked salmon paired with caviar was lost on me. I studied the appetizers like I studied the people across from me, seeking something authentic to anchor me. Maribel leaned forward and tapped her wine glass. "So, Miles," she began, her tone light but probing. "How long have you and Delilah been married now?" I suppressed a sigh. I'd told them a dozen times already, but the way they posed the question felt loaded. 3 years, I replied, swallowing. "Almost exactly." Ivy's gaze flicked to Sloane, and I detected a flash of sympathy in her eyes before she masked it with neutral politeness. 3 years, she repeated, as though testing the weight of the duration. "It's amazing how time changes people." Delilah laughed, a high, forced sound. "People change," she said, raising her glass again. "Isn't that why we're here?" The intimation was clear. We'd gathered to acknowledge change. I drank more of my beer, hoping the cold against my tongue would steady my nerves. "Then you should tell me what we're celebrating," I said, drawing their eyes back to me. I spoke calmly, but inside, my heart was pounding like a drum in a silent cathedral. Sloane set down her glass with a controlled sigh. "We're celebrating Delilah," she said, voice warm, her eyes shining with that practiced enthusiasm of hers. "She's embarking on a new project, a collaboration with Leo, if I'm not mistaken." She looked at Delilah, who glanced down at her lap as if caught in an uncomfortable spot. My throat tightened. "Leo," The DJ who once treated Delilah like a queen on the sands of Ibiza, the man whose return to town had been the unspoken rumor among this group. I realized then that the dinner invitation had less to do with me and everything to do with their plans. Celebrating Delilah's new project sounded like a toast to her next chapter, one I wouldn't be part of. I lifted an amuse-bouche to my lips, chewing slowly, buying time to process. Maribel clapped her hands lightly, drawing attention to herself. Isn't it wonderful? Delilah's creativity, her fearlessness, she began, and for the first time I noticed her admiration wasn't directed at me. Ivy gave a small nod, but her eyes drifted away, as though she knew the truth but didn't want to be part of the charade. Then Sloane chimed in. And this is why we're here, to cheer her on. She raised her glass, and without wanting to, Delilah lifted hers too. Their mouths curved in a practiced smile, while I, finding no words, raised my beer, the steel can feeling suddenly heavy in my palm. We're so proud of you, Sloane said, voice rich with sincerity, or maybe it was projection. I can't wait to see what you and Leo do together. The sentence landed between us with the weight of a verdict. I caught Delilah's eye, searching for a flash of regret or apology. Instead, I saw only determination, an almost imperceptible shift that signaled her readiness to step into the next stage of her life, with or without me. I felt something in me fracture, a fracture so silent I barely registered the moment it happened. While they talked about Leo's reputation, his connections in the music world, his knack for reinventing old hits, I sat back and listened, piecing together what I'd missed. The months of late-night phone calls, the excited texts Delilah dismissed as work chatter, the whispered meetings they pretended were innocuous. Every fragment painted a portrait of a future I'd never be invited to. My mouth went dry, and I pressed the can of beer to my forehead, hoping the cold metal would snap me out of the fog. But the fog only thickened, wrapping around my chest, squeezing until every breath felt like a choice between drowning and suffocating. I set the beer down with a clink that echoed louder than any toast. Well, I said, standing up before I lost my nerve, I think I've had enough. My voice sounded distant, as though I were speaking from underwater. The table fell silent. Sloane's eyebrows rose, Maribel's cheeks flushed with surprise, Ivy's lips parted in concern. Delilah placed her hand on my arm, but her grip was weak, as though she were afraid to hold on. Miles, wait, she began, voice trembling between defense and disappointment. I shook her hand off gently, though firmly. No, I said, voice low but resolute. I'm done celebrating tonight. I reached into my pocket for my wallet, leaving enough to cover my share, and added a few extra bills out of habit, still trying to be the generous partner I once was. I slid the money to the center of the table and gave them one last look. Enjoy the rest of your evening, I said, the words tasting bitter. Then I turned and walked away. Outside, the humid night air wrapped around me like a shroud, yet it felt infinitely more honest than the perfumed confinement of that dining room. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled for my keys, head spinning with 1,000 questions. How had I missed the signs? When did I become the prop in her performance? As I unlocked my car door and climbed in, I realized that I no longer recognized the man who still reached for her hand in public, who still dreamed of late-night conversations by alpenglow. That man had been eclipsed by someone I barely knew. And in surrendering my place at that table, I reclaimed a sliver of something that felt genuine, myself. The night spiraled from uncomfortable to cruel in a way that left me feeling simultaneously raw and numb. After the initial rounds of drinks and the endless parade of old stories about Delilah's exes, I had hoped dinner would shift back towards some semblance of normalcy, maybe a shared laugh, a mention of our home renovation, or at least a momentary truce from their relentless scrutiny. But instead, Maribel reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, flipping it open with a flourish that felt rehearsed. Within seconds, she was tapping through photo albums, as if curating an exhibit of Delilah's previous loves. The first image was of Delilah in a white sundress aboard a yacht, her windblown hair framing her face like a halo, and Ryan, Barcelona's artist extraordinaire, holding a paintbrush in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other. The scene looked sun-drenched and golden, like a postcard from someone else's life. Maribel passed the phone across the table. Sloane leaned in, her eyes glittering with satisfaction, and Ivy tilted her head to glimpse the screen. No one even looked at me. I felt Delilah's hand tremble on my arm, so I squeezed it gently, hoping to anchor her and myself in the reality we shared rather than in the ghosts they summoned. But Delilah merely offered a tight smile and a quick apology. Sorry, Miles, I forgot she saved these. Her tone was airy, like commenting on tomorrow's weather. No outrage, no defense, no attempt to pull me back into the fold. Instead, Maribel tapped the next photo, Delilah laughing with Troy, the sculptor, in a sunlit courtyard lined with marble statues. Each photograph was accompanied by a short anecdote from Maribel, whispered so that only Delilah could hear, but loud enough that I caught every detail: how Troy had chased Delilah through a field of poppies, pinning her against a stone wall until she surrendered with laughter, how he'd carved her name into marble, letter by letter, until she wept at the beauty of it. Delilah looked down at her lap, cheeks pink, as though embarrassed by the tenderness those moments once held. I wanted to speak, to remind them and to remind her that the present existed, that I was here, that I loved her intimately in ways they could never fathom. But my words stuck in my throat as Sloane suddenly stood, phone in hand, and looked around the table as though unveiling the punchline of a nasty joke. Speaking of exes, Sloane said, voice ringing out too clearly in the hushed restaurant. I heard Leo's in town. Her eyes darted between Delilah and me, a provocateur's gleam shining from beneath her lashes. Just saw his set at Pulse last night. They said he kept looking around, looking for someone. Delilah's face went slack. Her wine glass wobbled in her hand. Before she could cough or cover her mouth, Sloane pressed on. I thought it would be sweet if you two reconnected. You know, pick up where you left off. She laughed at her own words, a sound that felt like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Ivy and Maribel chuckled along, though Maribel's smile was tight, as if sharp edges lurked beneath. I watched Delilah's cheeks flush deeper, as though heated by equal parts shame and anger. She opened her mouth, as if pleading with them to stop, but no words came out. Instead, she looked at me, eyes wide and frantic, as though searching for a rescue that I had not yet offered. I wanted to grab her hand, pull her to me, and tell her this wasn't love. But she was already slipping away. When I finally spoke, my voice was low and quiet, an effortful anchor amid the storm. That's disrespectful, I said, meeting Delilah's gaze first, then Sloane's. To me and us. My words were deliberate, each one a stone thrown at the glass walls separating me from them. Sloane's eyes flicked to Maribel in silent amusement. Maribel's gaze flicked to Ivy, whose lips twitched in a half-smile that spoke volumes. Then they all turned back to me. The entire group sat in silence, save for the soft hum of other diners and the discreet clink of flatware. Delilah exhaled slowly, as though gathering breath for a performance, and finally said, God, Miles. You're so sensitive. Her tone was casual, as though she were commenting on my preference for dark roast over light roast. No wonder nothing's ever exciting with you. I tasted the contempt in her words, like salt across a wound, and felt my heart shatter into silent fragments. I drew in a slow breath, feeling the tension coiling in my chest, and realized that I could no longer pretend. Every ounce of disbelief, hurt, and betrayal that had been suffocating me for months coalesced into a single, determined moment. Exciting. I repeated, voice slightly louder. Exciting is being someone's priority, feeling safe with them, knowing they have your back instead of turning you into their punchline. Exciting is trust, Delilah, and respect. My words landed with weight, like a gavel striking a bench. I could see Sloane's smirk falter, Maribel's jaw clench, and Ivy's expression shift to something more complex. Regret, perhaps, or uneasy solidarity. Delilah's lips trembled, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. At that instant, the waiter returned with our main courses, placing plates of seared duck breast before Delilah and a pristine pasta carbonara before Ivy. Maribel's salmon looked succulent, and Sloane's steak was perfectly cooked. The dishes were beautiful, but I saw them as symbols of excess. Extravagances they could afford because their friendships thrived on cruelty rather than kindness. I stood up and drew my jacket over my shoulders. The table participants' eyes followed me, and their mouths parted in surprise. I'm done, I said, voice steady now with an undercurrent of resolve. Enjoy your meal. I paused, letting the words resonate, then turned and walked away without looking back, feeling the heavy fabric of betrayal fall away like an ill-fitting cloak. Outside, the July air felt warm on my skin, a stark contrast to the frigid intensity of the restaurant. I hailed a cab, every nerve in my body buzzing with equal parts adrenaline and grief. As the car pulled away, I watched the glittering city lights blur into streaks of gold and red. My phone buzzed in my pocket, probably Delilah's name flashing on the screen, but I ignored it, clutching my coat tight around me instead. In that quiet exodus, I understood that some connections are meant to break, not for spite, but so we can discover the strength to stand alone. And as the cab carried me forward, I realized this breaking point was mine to own, and that beyond this night lay the first breath of my new beginning. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, the last forkful of seared duck poised halfway to my mouth before I set it down and let the knife clatter against the plate. The restaurant's low hum of conversation and soft jazz music seemed impossibly distant, like a radio playing in another room. Around me, Sloane, Maribel, Ivy, and Delilah traded amused glances, as though they'd just witnessed a magic trick, only instead of making me disappear, they'd stripped me bare. The laughter that bubbled from their throats felt cruel rather than celebratory, each note a reminder that I was the only person in that booth not in on the joke. I thought about giving them an out, a chance to apologize or explain, but the tension in my shoulders told me their evening had nothing to do with me. They were already halfway through their courses, Delilah's plate practically untouched as she dabbed at her lips with a napkin, Sloane swirling her glass and catching the light like liquid diamonds. Maribel plucked at her salad, the leaves crinkling under her fingertips, while Ivy sat back, arms crossed, watching me the way one watches a bird pacing the edge of its cage. My role, I realized, was never to belong. I was merely a spectator, a foil for their shared history, a canvas on which they painted Delilah's past glories. When the bill arrived, I looked down at the check, nearly $500 for a dinner that had cost me more than money. The total stared back at me like an accusation, the cost of my humiliation itemized in 3 courses for cocktails and a bottle of wine I never touched. I slipped the check into the leather folder and handed it to Delilah's uneasy host, forcing my lips into a polite smile. The waiter thanked me, bowed slightly, and retreated into the haze of candlelight and hushed conversation. I felt the weight of the bill folder in my hand, an anchor pulling me away from that electric circle of disdain. Without a word, I reached for my wallet and pulled out a stack of bills, enough to cover my share, their drinks, the extravagant appetizers, and an ample tip. I placed the money methodically in the folder, smoothing the edges so it looked neat. My movements were deliberate, practiced. I had paid countless bills over the years without question. Tonight would be no different. No dramatic flourish, no need for a scene. My departure would be as quiet and clean as my life had once seemed, until they showed me how brittle it really was. I slid the folder across the table toward them. Delilah's fingers twitched, but she didn't stop me. "Don't worry about it," she murmured, voice small and defeated, like the last candle flickering before darkness. I raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Her friends watched me, their faces masks of polite curiosity, edged with something darker. Sloane's lips curved in a thin smile, and I wondered if she believed I'd actually let them off the hook. In a small act of defiance, I added a few extra bills on top of the folder, ensuring their tip rivaled the bill itself. Maybe it was my final proof of generosity, or maybe it was simply the habit of kindness I couldn't break, even when that kindness was met with indifference. I leaned back and met Delilah's eyes for the first time that evening, searching for a trace of the woman who had made me believe in us. Instead, I saw a stranger, a woman whose laughter came easily at my expense, whose enjoyment sprang from watching me shrink under her friend's gaze. I swallowed past the lump in my throat and stood, smoothing the wrinkles from my jacket. The restaurant's warmth transformed into the suffocating glow of judgment. I gathered my keys from my pocket, hefted my coat over my arm, and offered them one last parting gesture, neat, composed, irrevocable. "Enjoy the rest of your night," I said, voice calm and measured, though my heart pounded in my ears. The words settled between us like a full stop at the end of an essay. Delilah's eyes widened in surprise, as if she finally understood that I was leaving for good this time. Maribel's lips parted, as though she might say something, but no sound escaped her throat. Ivy's expression softened for a moment, and I thought I saw sympathy flicker there, but just as quickly it vanished. Sloane simply winked, a calculated, dismissive gesture that made my skin crawl. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the restaurant, the polished wood floors and linen-clad tables receding behind me in a blur of candlelight and murmured conversations. Once I pushed through the heavy door and felt the humid air of the city wash over me, I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with freedom and relief. The night was alive with the distant hum of traffic and the intermittent glow of street lamps, each light promising that the rest of my life stretched before me, vast and unwritten. I walked to my car in silence, every step reasserting my own worth, my right to be more than an accessory to someone else's story. In the driver's seat, I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes wide, mouth set in a determined line. I started the engine, the rumble of the car reassuring in its ordinary vibration, and pulled away from the curb. When I got home, the emptiness of the apartment welcomed me in a way that surprised me. No familiar laughter, no scent of her perfume mingling with mine, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft glow of streetlight filtering through the blinds. I opened the fridge, grabbed a leftover burger from a takeout container in the back, and heated it in the microwave. The sizzle of the meat as it warmed was oddly comforting, like the reassuring patter of rain on a rooftop. I settled onto the couch, burger in hand, and turned off my phone so the world would stop demanding my attention. I sat in the quiet, chewing thoughtfully, letting the taste of melted cheese and seasoned meat remind me how small pleasures could still anchor me. My mind raced with the events of the evening, the barbs, the betrayals, the finality of my departure, but I let those thoughts drift in and out without clinging to them. The apartment was dark except for the muted TV glow where a late-night talk show droned on in the background, voices laughing about things I didn't care to know. I munched on my burger, sipping cold lemonade from a glass, and let the steady rhythm of chewing and breathing guide me back to myself. When the burger was gone, I folded the wrapper and tossed it in the trash. I stretched out on the couch, arms behind my head, and stared up at the ceiling. My chest felt lighter now, as though a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying had been lifted. The silence wasn't lonely, it was a blank canvas. I closed my eyes and let my thoughts settle, feeling a slow, steady pulse of relief and possibility. Tonight had been the most expensive lesson of my life, in more ways than one. But as I sank deeper into the cushions, I realized that the cost of staying had been far higher. In letting go, I had reclaimed something I almost forgot existed, the right to be treated with respect, the freedom to choose my own story, and the knowledge that some chapters, no matter how long they last, are meant to end. At 11:14 p.m., my door shook so hard I thought the hinges would shatter. I just finished peeling the wrapper off the last fry from my burger when the pounding came. My heart thudded as I crouched by the peephole, peering through the tiny glass. Delilah's face filled the frame. Mascara streaked her cheeks, hair tangled around her shoulders, eyes red and frantic. Behind her, the glow of the hallway light carved her silhouette in dramatic relief. My jaw clenched, memories of the evening's humiliation surfacing like waves against a fragile shore. I opened the door a crack. Delilah pushed forward without hesitation, collapsing against me. "Miles," she sobbed, her voice cracking, "please." Her arms wrapped around me, soaking my shirt with tears. I froze, the taste of stale beer still on my tongue. Before I could speak, Jalen stepped up beside me. He filled the doorway with calm authority, tall, steady, his eyes sparking with protective fire. He slipped one arm around Delilah's shoulders and all but ushered her outside. "Miles isn't available," he said, voice firm. "Come back when you remember how to respect your husband." Delilah's sobs faltered. She looked from Jalen to me, confusion and hurt mingling in her gaze. "Please," she whispered again, reaching for my hand. But I didn't move. Jalen guided her down the hallway, softly but insistently. "We can talk tomorrow," he said, voice low. "Right now, you need to figure out what you actually want." I closed the door gently behind them, the click of the deadbolt sounding impossibly loud in the silence. I pressed my back against the cool wood and let my head fall forward, eyes closing. My apartment was dark, the glow of the city lights seeping through the blinds in thin stripes. I felt my pulse slow from its frantic pace, each beat echoing the same question. Why should I open the door to someone who'd spent the past hours tearing me down? Minutes passed like hours. The hollowness inside me pulsed with the tremors of betrayal. I remembered how Delilah had begged me, her voice raw and pleading, just words spoken too late. I recalled Jalen's unwavering stance, his words sharp but true. Respect was non-negotiable. Slowly, I peeled myself off the door and sank to the floor, legs crossed, back leaning against the wood. My phone lay on the coffee table, vibrating insistently. I didn't reach for it. Instead, I let the silence fill me. Memories of the evening flashed. Sloane's smirk, Maribel's sneer, Ivy's amused watchfulness, Delilah's laughter at my expense. Then I felt a warmth at my side, Jalen's hand on my shoulder as he'd spoken for me. I closed my eyes and drew a steadying breath, the scent of his cologne lingering like reassurance. Eventually, the vibration stopped. I rubbed my temples, the ache in my head matched only by the ache in my heart. I slid my back down the door until I sat on the cool floor, legs stretched out, staring at the blank expanse of the wall. The night outside hummed with distant traffic and the low murmur of the city, but inside I found a stillness I longed for. No judgments, no condescension, just the steady echo of my own breath. When I finally stood, I felt lighter, as though I'd shed a layer of doubt and pain. I flicked on the lamp beside the couch, its soft glow banishing the shadows. I poured a glass of water, then sank onto the couch, wrapping my arms around my knees. In that quiet, I realized how far I'd drifted from myself, how long I'd tolerated being treated as less than equal. But thanks to Jalen, and to my own breaking point, I understood that apology wasn't enough. I needed change. I set the glass on the coffee table and reached for my phone. There were no messages from Delilah, just the blank screen waiting for input. I stared at it for a moment, then powered it off. Tomorrow, I would decide what to say, how to move forward. Tonight, I would rest in the knowledge that I didn't have to fix what she broke. I closed my eyes and let sleep take me, the silence a promise of something stronger than fear. The promise of self-respect reborn. The morning light slanted through the blinds and sharp lines across my kitchen table as I sipped black coffee and scrolled through my phone, rubbing sleep from my eyes. Midway down my notifications list, I froze. A group text from Delilah's friends, all congratulating her on moving on so quickly. Beneath it, whispers of Jalen's name tangled with insinuations I'd spent the previous night with him in ways I'd never entertained. My hands trembled around the mug. The rumor mill had started before I even got out of bed. I replayed the night before, the pounding at my door, Delilah's tears, Jalen's unwavering defense. I'd been too stunned, too hurt by her betrayal in the restaurant to realize she would weaponize rumor next. Now each message felt like a fresh sting, a blade of mistrust cutting between us. I stared at the screen, disbelief mingling with fury. I wanted to call her, demand she tell the truth, but my voice cracked at the thought. How many lies had she already woven around us? I set my coffee aside and headed for Jalen's apartment down the hall. He answered the door bleary-eyed but alert, concern knitting his brow when he saw my face. "What's going on?" he asked. I showed him the texts. His jaw clenched as he read, then softened with anger on my behalf. "She really did this," he said quietly, sliding me inside. "That's low, even for her." I sank onto his couch, heart hammering. "She told them I had you over," I said, voice hollow. "She suggested something happened, and they all bought it." A bitter laugh escaped me. "She spread it like gospel." Jalen shook his head. "She tried to humiliate you and then blame you for it." He sat beside me. "I'm sorry, Miles. But you have us, your real circle." His words were balm to my raw nerves. We sat in silence for a moment, letting the truth of his loyalty settle into my chest. Later that day, I heard from Ivy. Her text read, "Miles, I'm so sorry. I never wanted this to happen. I didn't agree with their plan. Delilah orchestrated everything, even chose this restaurant because Leo always performs there. When he didn't show, she took it out on you. I feel terrible. Let me know if there's anything I can do." My chest loosened at her apology. I hadn't expected anyone from that circle to reach out. Ivy's words felt genuine, a stray lifeline tossed into my wrecked world. I called her, and we met for lunch at a quiet cafe. She arrived with no fanfare, loose hair, soft eyes that held real regret. "I shouldn't have stayed silent," she said, voice low. "I saw how they were treating you, but I didn't speak up until it was too late." She confessed that Delilah had painting pictures of me as jealous and controlling to justify her cruelty. "She wanted them to think you were the problem," Ivy said, pressing a napkin into her palm. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you." I listened as Ivy detailed how the dinner was planned around Leo's rumored appearance, how each question and toast was designed to belittle me. My knuckles whitened around the coffee cup. "She wanted me to chase Leo," I said, tasting the absurdity, "to prove I wasn't boring." Ivy nodded, tears glistening. "She attacked your confidence so you'd run after him, or at least look foolish trying." The weight of her words settled like ash. I realized how every moment with Delilah had been laced with performance, and I'd been the unwitting audience. Ivy reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You deserve better than their games," she said. "You deserve someone who sees you, not someone who uses you." Her kindness restored something cracked inside me. I nodded, feeling a spark of resolve ignite. "Thank you," I whispered, "for telling me the truth." We sat together a while longer, talking about real things. Childhood memories, favorite songs, the uncanny resemblance between her cat and a famous sitcom feline. With each genuine laugh, the remnants of the spin cycle fell away, and I remembered what honest connection felt like. When I left the cafe, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The rumor would fade. Ivy promised to correct it quietly. But more important, I knew I had chosen my own path. No longer would I be a pawn in someone else's elaborate performance. As I walked under the afternoon sun, each step echoed with renewed confidence. I was done circling their cruel games, and it was time to forge a circle of my own, one built on truth, respect, and real companionship. I hadn't planned on grocery shopping that evening, but something in me craved the mundanity of stocking up on produce rather than navigating another confrontation. The air inside the supermarket was cool and sterile, fluorescent lights humming overhead. I pushed my cart past the bakery and the deli, my mind drifting on a steady current of memories from the past weeks. When I rounded the corner into the freezer aisle, I froze. There she stood, Delilah, leaning against the frozen peas, a forlorn figure caught between regret and relief. Her hair hung in loose waves, and she wore the same expression I'd seen in my dreams. Vulnerable, remorseful, uncertain. My chest tightened. All the hurt and anger I thought I'd left behind seemed to flood back in an instant. "Miles," she said, voice hushed, the syllable trembling. She stepped forward as my cart rolled between us. "Can we talk?" I studied her quietly, my hands gripping the cart's handle so tightly my knuckles ached. The fluorescent light haloed her features, magnifying the exhaustion in her eyes. "There's nothing left to say," I replied, voice low. I glanced at the freezer door beside her, its frost patterns etched like memories too stubborn to wipe away. Delilah looked down, lip quivering. "I was stupid," she whispered, voice catching. "I'm so sorry. I really am." She pulled a shopping list from her pocket and smoothed it against her palm, as though it were a shield. "I miss us. I miss you." I felt the air inside me shift, vulnerability swirling in my chest like fog. I thought of the bruising dinner, the rumors, the nights I'd spent replaying every sharp word. Yet here she was, offering an apology so raw it threatened to break me all over again. "I don't think you miss me," I said, swallowing against the lump in my throat. My voice sounded distant, even to my own ears. "You miss someone who tolerated your disrespect. You miss someone who would sacrifice her own dignity for your approval." Delilah's eyes brimmed with tears. She opened her mouth, then closed it, searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow. Finally she said, "I was trying to prove something to them and to myself. I forgot what really matters." I thought of how Delilah used to anchor me, her laughter seeping into the silent corners of my heart, turning empty spaces golden. "You forgot who we were," I said softly. "And I've spent weeks remembering." She nodded, tears tracing wet paths down her cheeks. I noticed the basket at her feet, frozen peas, a bag of vanilla ice cream, a lone bunch of asparagus. Simple staples, life's small comforts. My own cart held similar items. Ordinary, honest necessities. Delilah reached out, fingertips grazing my arm. I flinched, but didn't pull away. "I'm sorry for everything," she said. "I let their cruelty change me, but I want to change back. For you." I closed my eyes, exhaling steadily. The cooling air of the freezer aisle felt almost cleansing. I thought of my new beginning with Ariel, the laughter I now shared, the respect that formed the foundation of our bond. I realized that forgiving Delilah wouldn't mean returning to the past. It would mean acknowledging my own growth. "I don't know if we can go back," I said finally, voice calm. "But I believe people can change." I met her gaze, seeing hope flicker there. "You need to prove it to yourself first." Delilah nodded, a tear escaping. "I understand." I tipped my head toward my cart. "Want to finish shopping together?" I offered. She smiled tentatively, and together we moved on. Two people walking separate paths, carrying the lessons of our shared history as we shopped in silent solidarity under the hum of those bright, unblinking lights. I never imagined that the end of one story would be the beginning of another, but there I was, standing in the bright kitchen of Ariel's apartment, the morning sun slanting through the windows and casting golden patterns on the countertop. The smell of freshly ground coffee filled the air, mingling with the scent of basil and garlic from the sauce simmering on the stove. Ariel moved with effortless grace, chopping cherry tomatoes for our frittata, her laughter bubbling up as she recounted a culinary disaster from her childhood. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the gentle tilt of her head when she concentrated on a slice of green pepper. This was the kind of morning I'd once assumed was beyond me, reserved for people whose lives were free of the kind of cruelty I'd endured. "Pass the basil," she said, and I handed it over, our fingers brushing for just a moment. The spark that shot through me was warm and steady, not a flame that threatened to burn everything down. I smiled, thinking how natural it felt to be here, side by side, rather than sitting across a table where I was made to feel small. Ariel glanced up, returning my smile with one that spoke of both affection and solidarity. We ate our frittata on the small balcony overlooking the city. The sky was clear, and the distant hum of traffic felt like a soothing lullaby instead of a reminder of restless nights. I sipped my coffee and talked about the writing workshop I planned to attend, gesturing with animated hands, while Ariel listened, genuinely interested. She asked questions, remembered details I'd mentioned days ago, and celebrated my goals as though they were her own. In her presence, I felt seen and respected. Later, I joked with Jalen that I'd finally mastered the art of cooking without setting off the smoke alarm. He laughed, high-fived me, and announced that next week he'd arrange a double date so his fiancée could meet Ariel. I felt that familiar knot of anxiety. What if new friends disappointed me? But Ariel squeezed my hand, and I exhaled, trusting this circle of kindness for the first time. That evening, I found the $500 dinner receipt tucked behind the bedroom mirror. It still sat there, a reminder of how much I'd paid to learn a lesson I wish I'd understood sooner. I picked it up and stared at the numbers, the total cost scrawled in black ink. Then I tore it in half, watching the pieces fall to the floor. The act felt symbolic, a final severing of the past's hold on me. As I swept the fragments into the dustpan, I realized how far I'd come. Love without respect had cost me dearly, but that investment had taught me to recognize my worth. Now, I spent my days gathering moments that felt genuine. Home-cooked breakfasts, late-night talks about dreams, silent walks through the park hand in hand. Each experience reaffirmed the lesson that had cost me $500 and countless sleepless nights, but also led me to something infinitely more valuable. Standing in the soft glow of my living room, Ariel at my side, I smiled and whispered, "Worth every penny." And in that smile, I felt the truth of every word.